Let's talk about this part of the permissions. Those letters here are divided into 3 different columns, each column having 3 different letters. Okay, you can see this as 3 columns. For each column, we can have a read, an R, a W, or an X. And these letters correspond to the different permissions that we can assign to the group. Remember that this is 3 columns. The first column belongs to the owner of the file. The second column are the permissions for the group of the file, and the third column are the permissions for all the other users. This is the permissions that will apply to any user that is not the owner and doesn't belong to the group of that file. Each permissions, we can have 3 letters. The first letter is the read permissions, the second is the write permission, and the third one is the execute permission. We will see the meaning of each one in another video. We will see here how can we manipulate those permissions. To change the permissions of a file or a directory, we use the chmod command. This command has 2 modes. We can use the symbolic mode and the octal mode. In this video, we will see the symbolic mode. For changing the permissions of a column, here, for changing the permission, we first specify the column that we want to manipulate. So if we want to manipulate the first column that corresponds to the user, we'll use the U. And then we tell the command what are the permissions that we want this column to have. So for example, I will manipulate this one, file permissions. I have an R, W, and a minus sign. The minus sign means that this permission is not assigned. It's always the same order, read, write, execute permission. So in this case, this file only have read and write permissions. So here I will assign to the first command, the U, the permissions I want. So for example, imagine that I want to have read and execute permissions only. I will do that. So the user will have read and execute permissions. And then I will tell the file name or the file names. If I do that here, I can see that the permissions have changed and they correspond to the permissions I've tell the command to assign. Only the owner of the group or the super user can change the permissions using the chmod command on a file or on a directory. We can, for example, change 2 different columns at the same time. So for example, if I can change the user column, so I will pick a different combination, for example this, and the group column, this one, I can use the G is for group, and then I can assign the new permissions, for example RX. And in this case, this column, the user column, will change to read and write permission, and the second column will change to read and execute permissions. So if I do that, I can see that both columns, here and here, both columns have changed and they reflect the new permissions I've used here. If I want to change the permissions for the third column, I will use the O. So O is for other users, and if I don't put anything here, I will remove all permissions for that column. So here, O has no permission, so I have 3 minus signs here. And I've changed the 3 columns at the same time. If I want to assign the same permissions to both columns at the same time, I can, for example, imagine that I want to, for group and other users, to have read and write permissions. Here I'm telling that the column corresponding to the group and the column corresponding to the other users will have read and write permissions. If I do that, I can see that both columns, the group and other column, reflects now the same permission. It's the permissions I've used here. You can, of course, make combinations, for assign a permission for the user and for the other two columns at the same time using a comma-separated list of that, and you can do that. And we have there is another thing that we can do with the symbolic mode. Is we can add or remove permissions. So for example, here you can see that I have read and write permission for the three columns. I can, for example, for the user, add and execute permission. The plus sign means that it will add that permissions to the current permissions of that column. So it will add an X here because I'm adding execute permissions to the user here, and I can remove permissions. I can do, for example, I can use the same combinations. I can use the same combination as when I was using the equal sign. This will remove the write permission for the user, and this will add the execute permission for the group and the others and the other users. Here, okay. And this is the symbolic way of modifying the permissions of a file or a directory. If we want to change all the three columns at the same time, we can use the A for all and assign the permissions for the three columns at the same time. So for example, if I do that, okay, sorry, I will list the files, okay, change mode, all the permissions at the same time for that file, okay. All the permissions, I will assign the same permissions to the three columns at the same time. If I do that, okay, the three columns have changed, and I have the same permissions for the user, the group, and the other users.